Welcome everybody, and particularly warm welcome to Suzy Houston, from the Judicial Institute. Suzy is the training director. Is that correct, Suzy? Director of training.
Our head of education is my official title. Don't let the sheriffs know you call me a director. They wouldn't be happy.
Head of education.
Yeah.
Thank you. And has been mediating in the mediation clinic, and I think also in Edinburgh Sheriff Court. So I was trained as a mediator. But as Suzy has already hinted, she deals with the training of Scotland's judiciary, sheriffs, and even higher up judges than that, which is a fascinating um, task and insight in itself, and particularly because I know, Suzy, you're not from a law background. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. So good on you. And many of us who come into mediation aren't. So today, Susie's going to share her understanding and knowledge around trauma-informed practice, which has become a bit of a theme in the justice system in Scotland. And in fact, the government seems committed to ensuring that we are trauma-informed. So who better than Susie to tell us more about that? Over to you, Susie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlie. Appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. I've entitled it Trauma-Informed Practice for Mediators. But I'd really like my presentation to spark some discussion where people here can contribute their views. I've probably got enough to speak for about 30 minutes. I think that's probably enough to listen to me waffling on, and then the floor will be open for us to have a more general discussion. It'd be interesting to hear your perspectives. Some of you yourselves may be trauma trained and have some insights there. It's important to make it clear at this stage, though, this isn't trauma training. I'm not providing you with trauma training. Even the most basic training in trauma-informed practice can take several hours or even days to complete. And after that, it's still very much an ongoing learning process. But what I'm going to do is give you some insight into what trauma training can involve. I'll signpost some useful resources. In the blurb for this presentation, I also provided a number of links that related to the sort of external drivers that are pushing this agenda in Scotland. And you can explore those further if you're interested in learning more. I'd also like to give some credit to an organisation called Epione. They have been involved in trauma training in SCTS, and I've used some of the material that they use in their training resources within this presentation, so it's important they're credited. You can find information about them. They're a very knowledgeable company. They provide training to organisations in trauma, so worthwhile checking out if you're interested in that for your own organisation or yourself. As Charlie said, my name's Suzy, and I qualified as a mediator in January 2023, so I'm still relatively new to this area of work. I recognise a number of faces. It's been great to mediate with some of you already, and I've done a number of mediations to date. I started off with the Citizens Advice Bureau in Edinburgh, doing some mediations in the Edinburgh Sheriff Court, and more recently I've been lucky enough to do some work as an assistant mediator with the clinic. And as Charlie said, my day job is as the head of education for the Judicial Institute for Scotland. The Institute is what's described as an emanation of the Lord President. We're a creature of the Lord President, and we're responsible for all aspects of the professional development of judicial office holders in Scotland. Just move on to the next slide here. So our training programme on trauma-informed judging is essentially a full-day course that's provided in person in Edinburgh. It was first developed and delivered in 2022, and that was done in cooperation with forensic psychologists. One was called Dr. Caroline Bruce. She's very prominent in this field in Scotland. And the other was Anne McKechnie, who is part of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry team. And the course was developed in response to a recommendation for judicial trauma training, which was contained in the Lord Justice Clerk's review group report, which is improving the management of sexual offences cases, published in 2021. I've provided a link to that in the blurb for this session. I can also provide that to anyone who's interested. You can Google it and it comes up quite easily. At this point, the course has been provided to all senators of the College of Justice. They're the most senior judges in Scotland, along with the majority of sheriffs and summary sheriffs. And we aim to have completed this first stage of judicial training in trauma by early 2025. All new judicial office holders do the course now as part of their induction as well. And a new trauma course for those sitting in the High Court called Complexities of Sexual Offences Cases is aimed at assisting judges in identifying problematic practices that may occur during cross-examination during commissions. So that's where witnesses are asked to give their evidence on video itself as a special measure to prevent re-traumatisation in certain trials. And this is important that judges are given this training because of the position that they have in the court and in case management. But the thing to grasp about trauma-informed practice is that for it to be successful, it needs to be systemic. So it needs everyone who works in the court and in wider organisations involved in justice, including those who are responsible for developing policies and procedures for the court estate and the buildings, and justice partners like the Crown, defence agents, SCTS and their court staff, and arguably mediators, to all be trauma-informed and to be able to work together to avoid the potential re-traumatisation of complainers and witnesses. And I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that in due course. Much of the work that's been done so far has focused on sexual offences cases, and that's for obvious reasons, but there is acknowledgement that trauma-informed practice is relevant in many other areas of justice, essentially anywhere where there are vulnerable people involved. And that could be included in family cases, in tribunals such as the Mental Health Tribunal, and maybe even in simple procedure cases. The important thing to note is that a trauma-informed approach, and this is in my opinion, is a good approach to have by default for anyone with vulnerabilities and not just trauma-experienced people. At this point, it's probably useful for me to pause and give you some basic information about what I actually mean by trauma. Does anyone have any suggestions about what they understand trauma to be in this context? Feel free to shout out if you do, or you can be silent if you'd rather not. I can't see the chat, so if you type in the chat, I can't see it.
I was going to volunteer. Is it like a persistent effects from a big event or significant event that someone's experienced, or an ongoing situation?
Thanks, Bronwyn. Yes, absolutely. I'll give you a sort of potted definition. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced or are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So pretty much what you said, Bronwyn. Very good. There are many definitions that are cited in the literature about trauma. The one that I've provided here is from SAMHSA in, in 2014, and it's comprehensive, widely acknowledged, and it's been adopted by the Scottish Government, so it's a good one to use. Excuse me. Note that this definition contains what's known as the 3 E's of trauma, and this can help us understand the subjective nature of trauma. And it includes the event or the events, the human experience, and the effect that it may have. Trauma can involve single and multiple events, but it's not the event itself that is the trauma, but rather the subjective experience of that event by the person. And when there's an absence of protective measures and relational buffers, the experience of trauma may impair a person's stress response system, which makes it more reactive to the smallest of triggers. It can affect our inner core and our sense of self. We no longer can trust others, ourselves. The world around us seems like a threat, and it can affect every aspect of our functioning: mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. I mentioned 2 sorts of trauma, sort of single and multiple events. They're known as sort of 2 categories, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 trauma is categorised as a single traumatic incident. Incidents are typically sudden, unexpected, and induce high levels of fear, horror, and helplessness. You may have heard of something known as post-traumatic stress disorder, it's PTSD. That's a condition that's associated with type 1 trauma, but not everyone who experiences a trauma will go on to develop PTSD. Is where a person experiences symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares. Some people with PTSD use alcohol or drugs to numb themselves and self-medicate. It can include negative cognitions and mood, disruptions in memory, feelings of self-blame, and it can cause people to experience things like hypervigilance, poor sleep, and so on. Type 1 traumas can include things like witnessing a murder, road traffic accidents, a single incident of rape or a violent attack, other sorts of accidents, medical trauma, robbery, and so on. Now, the other type is type 2 trauma. It's known also as complex trauma because it involves multiple traumatic events that are repeated over usually extended periods of time, and often with an anticipation that the trauma is going to happen again. This form of trauma and abuse is usually experienced interpersonally, and it persists over time, and it's quite difficult to escape from, usually. Typical examples of this include things like domestic abuse, repeated sexual abuse, childhood abuse, and that can be emotional, physical, sexual neglect, repeated incidents of bullying. Because complex trauma tends to occur interpersonally, it can be more extensive in its impacts across a whole range of functioning. And although complex trauma does tend to be experienced in the context of a close relationship, it can also be experienced in things like war, the context of war, torture, human trafficking, etc. And the condition associated with type 2 trauma is known as complex PTSD or CPTSD. And that can include all the symptoms that I've described related to PTSD, but with the addition of things like difficulty managing emotions, difficulty with interpersonal relationships, difficulties trusting other people, a negative self-concept, feelings of shame and worthlessness, etc. So a whole range of really unpleasant symptoms. Both types of trauma can occur in childhood and adulthood. People often experience a sort of layering of both forms throughout their lives. And trauma that occurs in childhood is often referred to as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. There was a 2015 study of over 2,000 Welsh adults by Public Health Wales, and they found 47% of the subjects they interviewed reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and 14% reported having 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And within that study, they found that compared with people who had no adverse childhood experiences, those of the group that had experienced 4 or more ACEs were 4 times more likely to be a heavy drinker, 6 times more likely to smoke, 11 times more likely to smoke cannabis, 15 times more likely to be violent, 16 times more likely to take drugs, and 20 times more likely to go to prison at some point. So you can see that trauma can lead people into the justice system in multiplex ways, either as an accused person or as a victim, or both. So towards the end of that video, there was an explanation about how trauma can have a bearing on the evidence-giving process, and some discussion about the ways in which trauma-informed approaches can assist a witness to give their best evidence and prevent something called re-traumatization. I guess for mediation, we're not really concerned with evidence giving. And in fact, we probably want parties to move away from the evidence and look forward to new and collaborative solutions. But if somebody is dysregulated emotionally or has difficulties with communication and interpersonal relationships, then this may make the process of negotiating a solution much more challenging. And in some circumstances, mediators may also need to think about measures to prevent re-traumatization during a mediation session. So re-traumatization is reliving stress reactions experienced as a result of a traumatic event when faced with a new or similar incident. And on the slide, you can see some of the things that might cause re-traumatization in a justice context, mostly a court-based context. So things like poor communication, not being able to prepare, not being prepared for the experience of court, things like legal jargon, not understanding the language that's being used, not having your rights explained to you, etc. Now, as professionals, we obviously don't plan to hurt the people that we serve. And I think most of us as mediators came into this particular line of work to help and support and empower people involved in disputes to find resolutions. However, holding up a trauma-informed lens to our practices can help us open up to the likelihood that some of the systems or standard practices that are being used may unintentionally cause harm. I'd be willing to bet this is much more applicable to a court setting, but it may also be relevant to mediations, especially those that are held within a courtroom or within a courthouse. We can inadvertently do things which could be perceived or experienced as hurtful. This could be anything that reminds a trauma-experienced person of the oppressive dynamics of their own trauma. For example, if you had somebody in a mediation, a woman who's been the victim of coercive control by a male partner within a domestic abuse context, that person may find the dynamics of questioning by a man to be re-traumatizing. Now, it might be unrealistic to say that people will never experience hotspots that are likely to cause them distress or re-traumatization when they're in a court. Things where they're asked to recount the event of being sexually assaulted or violently attacked or abused as a child or witnessing a murder, because obviously that's part of giving evidence. But ensuring that the experience and the support that's provided to somebody before, during, and after giving evidence can help to mitigate the potential for secondary harm. In a mediation setting, it's arguably important for us to be alive to the idea that the dynamics in the environment of a mediation session might be potentially re-traumatizing to some people. As I've just mentioned, maybe somebody who has experienced domestic abuse or a survivor of war or a victim of a terrible accident may find themselves in a mediation and be re-traumatized by something that occurs. I think this is probably less likely than it would be in a court context, but it's still always a possibility and something we should be mindful of. This slide is useful. It gives a sort of diagram to show how trauma can impact on victims, witnesses, and the justice workforce as a whole, of which mediators are a part. Appreciate it's quite a busy slide. I'll give you a couple of seconds to take it in before I talk again. So you can see that the tree motif is useful. It shows how trauma is like the sort of roots of a tree or foundation of which we grow out of as our life progresses. It's also reminiscent of the neurobiology of the brain, which we looked at in that video. The idea of the brain as being 3 levels built from the bottom up. So from the sort of reptilian brain, the limbic system, and then the neocortex on the top, the conscious brain over the top. Traumatic experiences affect the way that our brain, including things like memory, work. It also impacts on our emotions and our relationships and our sensitivity to future trauma and re-traumatization. Within the justice system, this can impact on the way in which people give their evidence, their ability to participate in justice, and also how this impacts on the wider justice workforce. So for a witness, trauma might make it difficult for them to recall events. That might impact on their credibility as a witness. For someone who works in a court setting, if you're exposed regularly to traumatic subject matter, then this could result in secondary trauma or something that's known as vicarious trauma as well. And that's where you experience things like burnout, loss of empathy, disconnection, possibly leading to things like self-medication with alcohol and drugs, etc. And that could be anyone who's operating in that environment. So I've got another short video to play for you. Thankfully, it's not as long as the other one. It's only a minute or so, but it's quite powerful. So I'll just play that now. So part of being trauma informed is about recognising how working with victims of trauma can have an impact on the well-being of the workforce. If we don't take measures to protect ourselves, then we may ourselves suffer serious consequences. Protective measures are often interpersonal, things like debriefing, talking therapies, also things like exercise, getting out into nature, and as demonstrated in that video, pets. Everyone is different. But what we're learning in the justice sector within this sort of training, within my organisation and within the judiciary, is that there is a need to look out for each other and to be able to recognise when somebody is struggling, including yourself. Lost my mouse now. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about trauma-informed principles. They're, I suppose, the antidote to re-traumatisation, and they offer the opposite of what's been experienced previously to reduce traumatisation, re-traumatisation. Trauma is inherently disempowering, and we seek not to replicate those damaging dynamics. You can see those listed on the left, but instead promote principles of trauma-informed practice. And increasingly, people working in justice in Scotland, including the judiciary, are beginning to understand the prevalence of trauma in justice-involved populations and advocating that there is an increasing need to adopt trauma-informed practices in court, in tribunal proceedings, and in judicial decision-making. Being trauma-informed is an understanding of the impact of trauma and how it can affect justice-involved populations, including victims, children, families, staff, and organisations working with those populations, and arguably mediators. Part of being trauma-informed comes from embedding trauma-informed principles within your own practice and your professional interactions, and an organisation if you work within an organisation. So just in brief, on the right hand side, safety, that's recognising the importance of feeling physically and psychologically safe in your environment and during interpersonal interactions. Trustworthiness, so operating with transparency and aiming to build and maintain trust between staff and people who are accessing a service. Choice, which is recognising that giving people choice can help address power imbalances and provide them with meaningful choice and a voice in decision making. Collaboration, which is recognising the importance of providing space to share decisions, and empowerment, which is implementing a person-centred approach and recognising individual strength, resilience, and building upon this to promote recovery. I don't know about you, but these principles to me are quite reminiscent of some of the underpinning philosophy of mediation, which I think is quite interesting that's already sort of there in alignment. Okay, so I've talked for quite some time. We've got about 20 minutes, so I thought it would be a good opportunity now for us to discuss as a group of mediators some of these questions, and maybe you have your own questions that you or comments that you'd like to share. So just like to open up the floor. I've put some questions here as a sort of starter for 10. Would anyone like to put across anything they have to say?